I don't know whether I'm supposed to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for this webinar, but I want to welcome you all to NGO Monitor's webinar to launch our policy paper on the implementation of the IHRA Definition of Antisemitism and its links to NGO funding. Each of these terms has a lot of significance, and so in the next couple of minutes, I'll give you a background to this effort, to the policy paper that we're launching, and then I'll be honored to introduce our guest speakers and present the overall framework. First of all, for some of you, this may be the first introduction to NGO Monitor, so I'll tell you a little bit about the organization. This is a project I started about 18, 19 years ago after the NGO forum of the now infamous UN Durban Conference on the elimination of racism and other forms of xenophobia. It took place in September 2001. And the NGO forum there, approximately 1,500 organizations participated, some of the more powerful and best known organizations that were considered to be the movers and shakers in the realm of human rights. And they adopted a resolution in a very chaotic and anti-Semitic framework that took place in Durban, South Africa, for the complete international isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. And they used language like genocide and ethnic cleansing and war crimes in that context. And that's when I began seriously to pay attention to the politics of NGOs and realized that of the need for all sorts of forms of checks and balances, that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, particularly in the human rights realm, are extremely powerful with massive budgets, and there were no checks and balances, there were no guidelines, and a lot of the activities that they were involved in under the name of human rights were targeting Israel, were leading the demonization of Israel. We now know this through language like lawfare and the BDS movement, but also, and this was 18 years ago as it began to develop, that was the beginning of NGO Monitor, we've also developed the process of an understanding that these organizations, not only do they, in many cases, not have anti-Semitism on their agendas, but they are often contributors in different ways to different forms of anti-Semitism. So that's the background to the activities of NGO Monitor. We're a research organization. Most of our staff members are involved in research, and we produce research reports, analyses, comparative analyses. What are these organizations doing, primarily but not exclusively within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also in some cases looking at this in comparative basis. We are ECOSOC, we have ECOSOC status, which means that we participate in the discussions of the UN Human Rights Council and other United Nations frameworks. Our research is presented very often to governments, to in academic frameworks and other different forms. And in particular, as I said, we began to look over the last few years and began to see more and more evidence of the spillover from claiming to advance universal human rights, which we often argue is not at all what these organizations are doing, but also to be either complicit with or participate actively in different forms of anti-Semitism. And I'm sure this will come up in the discussion, certainly in the presentation when Olga presents, or Olga Deutsch presents our policy paper, then there shall be, and I'll show you a number of very specific examples, but they have been increasing over time. Now, when the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, was established in Stockholm in 1998, this was not a direction that we expected them to move in. That it was not clear what they were going to be doing with this framework, but it was clear this was part of a response within Europe to growing concerns about anti-Semitism. We're talking about 22 years ago. One of the important products of this, one of the important publications and initiatives of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has been the promulgation of a working definition of anti-Semitism that was, I guess, adopted or set forth back in 2016. It was based on a European monitoring center definition that was quite similar, and our first speaker, Mike Whine, was very much involved in that. So I will be careful not to give my version of the history, but rather leave it to him. When the 2016 working definition came out, it's 2 short pages with a number of examples. It began to gain a lot of support. I believe there are now over 30 countries, although you can correct me if I'm wrong, 32 maybe, that have adopted in different forms in terms of their official designation, but that have adopted this working definition, in some cases by parliaments through resolution, in some cases officially by governments, in some cases like the US and Canada with some slight changes. But in general, this has become what I say and what we say is the consensus working definition of anti-Semitism. And that's extremely important because prior to this, there was no accepted definition, and there were constant arguments about how you classify whether it's a violent crime or it is a set of statements, even in textbooks, whether these constitute or do not constitute anti-Semitism. The working definition gives us some guidelines for doing that. And there are examples in that, and I won't go into the details of that, but I will simply say that the concept of having a consensus is extremely important. Now, what we are doing in this process, and as I said, Olga Deutsch will be presenting the policy paper, is we are also showing the need for guidelines within the realm of the NGOs that are active in these issues. Not only for the NGOs themselves, because as I said, the lack of checks and balances allows them very often to go far from what their stated goals are and to actually contribute to type of anti-Semitism and racism that we often see, but also that the donors that enable, that provide the massive amounts of money, overall around the world, of billions of dollars a year, specifically on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, just for human rights NGOs, they're probably over $150 million, 160 million, 140 million euros, whatever currency you want to use, specifically for NGOs that claim to promote these agendas. And the lack of guidelines to limit and to examine and to allow for due diligence and funding on the issue of anti-Semitism often is shown in the activities with these organizations and in their statements and pronunciations. And so the need for applying this definition also in the contracts and the grants that are provided to NGOs and to monitor them is, I think, an important aspect, and that's why we're doing this launch. The speakers that we have, and we're very honored to have them as part of this, have made tremendous contributions in this area, and I'm really humbled to see, first of all, that they've agreed to join us. Actually, our first speaker, I got it backwards, Ellie Cohanim, served as the US Deputy Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism until very recently at the US Department of State. And anybody who followed her work or her social media knows how much she contributed in that process. And that's also part of that is the emphasis, the highlighting of the importance of the IHRA working definition. She helped to carry out policies, to inform those policies, and to work on initiatives in this area. And before that, she was known for the work that she did in the Jewish Broadcasting Service and in the Yeshiva University, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the New York Federation, and many other aspects. So she's certainly one of the real experts in this. I'm going to introduce Mike Whine right now so that I don't have to interrupt in the middle. Mike Whine, first of all, is a friend and a colleague, someone whose work I have admired and been privileged in some ways to participate in for many, many years. He's a senior consultant at the World Jewish Congress. It's impossible to describe, and certainly not in 2 sentences or even much more, all the activities and all the accomplishments he's had. He's acted as the lay advisor to the Counterterrorism Division of the Crown Prosecution Service. In September 2013, he was appointed as the UK member of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, which is the human rights agency of the Council of Europe. And he had a very central role in the original writing of the definition and the whole process of coming up with the terms of a working definition of anti-Semitism, both in the Monitoring Center of the European Union and then as it was transferred into the IHRA. So we're very honored to have both of these speakers, and it really is my privilege to invite Ellie Cohanim to take the floor, so to speak, the virtual floor.
Good afternoon. Professor Steinberg, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to join you today. And I know we have an international audience, so I'm not sure exactly what time zone everybody's in, but I'll wish everyone a good afternoon. First, thank you for your kind introduction, for inviting me to join you today. Also, my thanks to Vice President of NGO Monitor, Olga Deutsch, and also to Combat Anti-Semitism Movement for inviting me. Before I begin my formal remarks, I just want to take a moment and really recognize the powerful work that NGO Monitor does. Your track record speaks for itself, and I just want to take a moment to recognize in the last year alone, we saw Denmark cut funding to organizations with ties to terror groups or groups which support the BDS movement. We saw Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark cutting $20 million over 4 years to NGOs with links to PFLP and other bad actors. And we saw Visa, MasterCard, and American Express shut down online credit card donations for a number of terror-linked NGOs. These steps were taken thanks to the hundreds of hours of research, writing, reporting, and advocacy undertaken by NGO Monitor's dedicated staff. And so truly, I commend the work that you do, not just today in the policy recommendations that you're going to be sharing with us, but day in and day out in everything that you do. So again, it's really my pleasure to be joining you. And with that, I'll start my formal remarks. I think the topic of conversation that we're discussing today, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism, is truly a most important subject. And as with any problem that society is asked to tackle, the first step, of course, is defining the problem. And that's what the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism does. It defines the problem for us. The United States State Department began using the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism back in 2010. And in 2016, as a member body of the IHRA, the US State Department formally adopted the IHRA working definition. In 2019, so just last year, we saw the executive order issued by President Donald Trump combating anti-Semitism, which then adopted the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism for all US executive agencies that were going to be enforcing the executive order. And so at that point, the United States is understood to have formally adopted the IHRA definition. In our office, the Office to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism at the State Department, which I just stepped down from that position, just resigned, it was one of our highest priorities was really engaging all foreign governments and all of our counterparts on the adoption of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It was truly an issue that we consistently engaged on with every counterpart. And I think to understand why this was such a priority for us, it's important to understand the state of anti-Semitism today. And to gain that understanding, I would bring our attention to two moments in recent history that I believe shed light on contemporary anti-Semitism. And so I would posit that the first moment is 1948. We kind of look at 1948 as a marker of the end of the Holocaust and the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. And so 1948 symbolizes the moment in history when, given the atrocities of the Holocaust and the exposure of the Nazi attempt of the genocide of the Jewish people in the final solution, in that moment, classical anti-Semitism was forced to take a break. It was understood that the world would not tolerate for that one moment classical Jew hatred. And so the classical manifestations of Jew hatred became somewhat intolerable in polite society. The next turning point in the history of contemporary anti-Semitism, I would posit, was 1967. In the aftermath of the 1967 war in Israel, when, despite the very young and still struggling Jewish state of Israel being attacked by Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, Israel emerged the winner of the war and gained the territories of the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank, including Jerusalem from Jordan. In 1967, Israel went from being the David to being the Goliath. She went from being perceived as the weak underdog to being perceived as a strong state with military prowess. This perception shift, I would posit, allowed for the new form of anti-Semitism, which could indeed be tolerated by polite society. It could be espoused in academia and in the halls of power worldwide, and of course in the NGO world. And that anti-Semitism is the hatred of the Jew among nations. That is the hatred of the Jewish state of Israel. When you fast forward to 2020, and you have now 75 years of historical distance from the end of the Holocaust, today we live in a world in which both classical anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jew, exists side by side with the new anti-Semitism, that is the hatred of the Jewish state of Israel. And so the best examples of this that I can share is the recent mass proliferation of online conspiracy theories blaming the creation or the spread of the coronavirus on the Jews writ large. And side by side with that, we see a member of the United States Congress just last week, Representative Rashida Tlaib, Democrat of Michigan, labeling Israel, quote, and I quote, a racist state, unquote, and lobbying the false accusation that Israel is denying the Palestinians access to the COVID vaccine, despite the reality that the Oslo Accords placed all health and social welfare under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. In this present environment, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism becomes the most important tool in the toolbox of combating anti-Semitism, for the very fact that the working definition, through the examples that are listed beneath it, addresses both classical anti-Semitism and the new anti-Semitism, which we are again witnessing all over the world in this global rise of anti-Semitism. Such that the examples listed under the IHRA working definition include, and here I quote, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews. And it goes on, such as myths of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, etc. The examples also address Holocaust denial as anti-Semitic, and then move on to, here I quote again, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, unquote. And it goes on, I quote again, applying double standards by requiring of it, meaning of Israel, a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. And it goes on, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, unquote. From just these few examples that I read to you just now, underneath the working definition of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, we see that the working definition is indeed comprehensive and addresses all forms of anti-Semitism. The value of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism to governments is twofold. On the one hand, it serves as a bar or a goalpost by which all governments can self-monitor, and that is a critical part, a critical role that every government must play, self-monitoring and really making sure that no entity within the government structure is engaging in anti-Semitism. The second usage is, of course, in guiding governments in their funding decisions, which is another huge responsibility that all governments bear. Most governments are allocating millions and, as Dr. Steinberg just shared, billions of dollars in funding every year. So these funding decisions are being made every day. Specifically, as governments work in an ecosystem, I would say, in which NGOs receive sometimes their entire budgets or sometimes significant portions thereof from governments. Governments need tools to help answer the question of how do you determine the entity being worthy of the support of my government? Now, of course, there are rogue states like Iran, which is the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism in the world and actually spreads this vile hatred. Those governments we are assured are not really engaged in this question. But for all responsible state actors, it's a fundamental question. How do we govern while making sure that we do not cross the line into anti-Semitism, something that unfortunately we've seen Britain's Labour Party, for example, struggle with recently, and I believe they've made great progress. And again, how do we fund the NGO ecosystem while making sure we are not helping to propagate anti-Semitism? In our administration, we face this exact situation when reports surfaced that Heshmet Khalifa, the then head of the NGO Islamic Relief Worldwide, had made statements calling Jews, quote, the grandchildren of monkeys and pigs, unquote, and had praised terrorists. Following international outcry, Khalifa was asked to step down, but then we saw the entire board of IRW resign soon after, when it surfaced that the man who replaced Khalifa had himself glorified terror attacks and described Israel as, quote, the Zionist enemy, very interestingly echoing the language of the Iranian regime. In response to the overwhelming evidence of blatant and horrific anti-Semitism exhibited at the most senior levels of IRW leadership, our office issued a statement in December condemning the organization and encouraging all other governments to conduct reviews of IRW as the State Department had done. We were pleased to see that the Dutch government soon followed our course, and recently they announced too that they have cut funds to IRW. I wish that Islamic Relief Worldwide was a lone organization with this kind of hard anti-Semitism exhibited from its top brass. But unfortunately, we on this call, this conversation, we all know that not to be true. You will be hearing shortly from NGO Monitor their new policy paper on the implementation of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism and NGO funding. I believe that international efforts to encourage governments and entities to adopt the IHRA working definition have been truly successful to date, and I think that we all have much to be proud there to see that list of countries adopting the IHRA definition growing on a daily basis. I commend the NGO Monitor on being at the forefront of the effort now to move the conversation to next steps. That is, figuring out how do we move from adoption to implementation. My thanks again to each of you for joining us today, to NGO Monitor for inviting me, and I look forward to taking questions at the end of the program. Thank you.
Ellie, that was terrific. A lot of food for thought. Mike, since I've already introduced you, look forward to hearing your contribution.
Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening. When the three of us and the two OSCE experts went to Vienna in 2004 to finalize the EUMC working definition of anti-Semitism, we little realized it would lead to the angry debate we're seeing now. We'd responded to the EUMC's call for a definition that EU member states' law enforcement agencies and human rights commissions could use to gather data on anti-Semitic incidents and crimes and to introduce consistency in defining anti-Semitism. Law enforcement agencies and human rights agencies in Europe had complained, and they formally complained to the Commission, that everyone had their own definition, which made it impossible to measure incidents with any consistency. The EUMC and their bosses in the European Commission needed better information to base any counter strategies on. The EUMC didn't adopt the definition because it wasn't their place to do so. They're not a standard setting agency, but a research agency serving the Commission's needs. 17 years later, 28 states, the Intergovernmental Human Rights Agency, and nearly 400 other agencies have adopted the definition, albeit now in slightly amended form as the IHRA definition, and are using it to recognize anti-Semitism and to train law enforcement agencies to record it. Now some civil society groups and academics come to terms with it. Many of them reject the Universal Convention that anti-Semites now frequently use anti-Zionism or anti-Israel bias as a cloak to hide their Jew hatred. The 2008 European Council Declaration, and I can talk about the European Council later if those of you that don't know what it does, if required, but the Council Declaration gives the definition force in Europe. It calls on the member states that have not yet done so to endorse the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism employed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance as a useful guidance tool in education and training, including for law enforcement agencies in their efforts to identify and investigate anti-Semitic attacks more effectively and efficiently. Our mandate and our contract to research the definition's use derived from the two council declarations on combating anti-Semitism, the one I've just quoted from, that of 2018, and the more recent one of 2020. This later declaration calls on all EU member states to maintain the fight against anti-Semitism across policy areas. Our research report, contracted by the Commission and IHRA, resulted in the handbook for the practical use of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, published 4 weeks ago. This relates the definition's 11 examples to real incidents and crimes. It also illustrates good practices for applying the definition. Our 6 months intensive research involved each of the contracting parties sending extensive questionnaires to governments and Jewish communities. In some cases, we followed up with additional questionnaires to tease out more information. FRA, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, which replaced EUMC, but with a slightly different mandate, also now requires EU member states to declare in their anti-Semitism annual report if they're using the working definition and in what manner. Adoption may be via different processes, as has been said. It could be parliamentary adoption, it could be governmental, it could be inclusion in official reports. The definition, however, is not legally binding and states are not obliged to legislate it. European Council declarations also invite states to adopt holistic national plans to combat anti-Semitism. High-level commissioners or officials can help create the plans, oversee their application. They now meet half-yearly to coordinate amongst themselves and with the European Commission. I sit on that coordinating committee as well. Our research results exceeded our expectations. The definition is increasingly used to train police officers, prosecutors, and judges, as well as to identify and track manifestations of anti-Semitism. Second, it's increasingly used to categorize incidents collected by first responders, such as police officers, human rights bodies, both official and unofficial. Take-up is slow, but training is available. For example, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, an intergovernmental agency, and the World Jewish Congress are about to start training police officers in 10 small European states over the next 18 months to understand and monitor contemporary anti-Semitism. And of course, the EC itself undertakes to run hate crime training courses for police officers. All of this according to European criminal justice standards and to establish mutual collaboration between them and Jewish communities. The definition is also helping to direct funding to civil society and human rights organizations. Let me say this as forcefully as I can. The definition is a practical one. It's not an academic definition. When we started in 2004, we received many academics' contributions, but they were too long, they were impractical, and they lacked focus. What we needed was a definition that could be understood by first responders and used to advise criminal justice agencies and human rights bodies. I kept saying in all our discussions, if a policeman on the streets of Plots can't understand it, it's no good. In our research, we asked governments and Jewish communities if they could identify action against anti-Semitism by reference to the definition's 11 examples. Not all incidents are crimes, and states were not required to transpose the definition into law. One did, Albania. They had particular reason for doing so. They weren't asked to do so. And fortunately, I think, so far, they remain the only country that's legislated it. European law against hate speech and Holocaust denial is contained in the 2008 Council Framework Decision on Hate Crime, which must be transposed into national law. But European states were allowed to do so according to national circumstance, although a time frame was laid down for them to do it. But recording all incidents is vital, not just crimes. They help build an intelligence picture on which to base assessments and targeted action. They allow police officers to pinpoint hotspots in time and place. National commissioners or ombudsmen are being appointed, as the 2020 Council Declaration requested, to convey Jewish communities' concerns to their governments and to help progress national plans, including the application of the definition. To give us some idea of how states are applying the definition, our research looked first at the training of police and prosecutors, and they do increasingly use the definition. In the UK, the definition has been in the Police College Manual on Hate Crime since 2014. A few years later, it was added to Manual for prosecutors and judges. The EU Agency for Law Enforcement Training, CEPOL, that's the European Police Agency nobody's heard of, but they're very effective. They added it to their manuals for prosecutors and judges. The EU agency, the French National Agency, DILCRA, uses it for training police, magistrates, teachers, and civil servants. The Estonia Academy of Security Sciences teaches it to Interior Ministry civil servants and policemen, and the Jewish community in Spain teaches it to state security authorities. In the UK, CST have run special sessions for prosecutors and have participated in teaching seminars for all national police forces. Judges in Germany, Austria, UK, and elsewhere do use it now. Police forces are increasingly appointing regional or national points of contact for Jewish communities. This, again, is something that's contained within the Council Declaration. Police and prosecutor training includes community representatives now in many states. In the higher education arena, the European Union of Jewish Students called on universities in Europe to adopt policies to combat anti-Semitism, as has the German Centre for Training Lecturers, and in the UK, Oxford, Cambridge, and many other universities adopted the definition, some long before the Secretary of State called them to do so. Despite the pushback by some academics against the definition in Germany and the US, there are numerous good examples in Europe where universities and educational bodies are using the definition to combat anti-Semitism and to promote education about anti-Semitism. Most notably, the European Commission's Working Group on Combating Anti-Semitism, UNESCO, and the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights now publish training curricula for all schools and institutes of higher learning. Other best practices include financial support for those that promote the definition. For example, the British Education Secretary's support to universities adopting the definition, financial support. France, Austria, the Balearic Islands Parliament, among others, denying funding, state funding to organizations that do not support national plans against anti-Semitism. Last week's letter by 95 British and European student leaders in the Guardian newspaper explained why they needed the definition in a forceful rebuttal to the silly letter a few weeks earlier from retired lawyers and judges who argued against the definition on free speech grounds. The students accused critics of the definition of ignoring the reality of campus life for those facing anti-Jewish abuse. They wrote that the commentariat's, I quote, the commentariat's analysis of the adoption of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism by British universities does not resemble the reality we have witnessed on the ground. They added it's time for the discussion of the definition and its adoption by British universities to reflect the lived realities of Jewish students. Retired judges, activists based in the Middle East, and far-left non-Jewish academics are not in the front line enduring anti-Semitism on campus. We are. We believe that this definition affords Jewish students the best possible protection. They, end quote. They also said that Jewish students have long been campaigning in good faith for our universities to adopt this definition. They do so, and again I quote, because we seek to protect Jewish students and not the government of the State of Israel, adding that IHRA explicitly states that criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other states, cannot be considered anti-Semitic. UNESCO, together with the OSCE, ODIHR, have now published framework curricula for teachers training using the definition, and increasing numbers of football clubs are adopting the definition. This is particularly important given the dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incitement at football games. We found many, many more examples of good practice than we publish in our handbook for the European Commission, but space constraints and the need to provide some geographical spread limited what we could write. But one thing is clear, and that is that the definition does provide a useful and reliable tool for states to understand how anti-Semitism mutates and how they can start to fight it.
Thanks. That was a really terrific, not only summary, but an analysis of the importance of the working definition. I'll just comment that you said there was no expectation of the type of controversy and debate that's taking place back when this was being developed. But I think the fact that there is this pushback very much from the fringes of certainly of the NGO world, we see this in all the statements that are being put out, shows how effective it is. If you can't make an argument, if you can't disagree with, criticize Israeli policy without comparing the IDF to Nazis, without denying the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, without calling Israel racist, without singling out Israel with all these types of demonization that we often see from groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. Yeah. The whole BDS movement is only focused on Israel. Yeah. So I think it shows, and it's not just about Israel. And that is a good way for me to introduce Olga Deutsch, because there's so much blatant anti-Semitic material that uses Israel as a target. But in this community of NGOs, it's really hardcore, what we call often theological or the old anti-Semitism. And our next speaker, the person who's going to present our work, has been working on this for quite a long time. I have to do a quick introduction, Olga. Olga Deutsch is the Vice President of NGO Monitor and has been with us now for what, 4 years? Your mic is on.
Five, almost five and a half now. Yeah.
And comes from very strong, she was president of the European Union of Jewish Students. It's a very strong background in dealing with a lot of these issues, and was working in a very successful business career and decided to throw it all away and join the work that NGO Monitor does. And we've been extremely lucky and very proud to have her as the work that she's doing as someone who's contributed so much. And she's been the lead person on developing these guidelines, and everything that Mike, you talked about, and the importance of the practical application is certainly relevant in the world of NGOs, particularly those that get government funding. So Olga, this is again a pleasure for me and an honor for me to, even though we work together very closely, we don't like to see each other very often these days, but at least in a virtual sense. So please present to have you present that the guidelines and the policy paper is an extremely important part of this presentation.
Thank you, Gerald. It always warms me to hear it in a public forum. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and obviously thank you, Ellie and Mike, for incredible words of wisdom. You set a high bar, and it was probably most definitely the best introduction to what we are about to present. You both painted both the importance and relevance of the IHRA working definition and how it successfully combines the examples both from old, classic, medieval, if you'd like, anti-Semitism, and what we call more contemporary nowadays incidents and examples of anti-Semitic narratives. But at the same time, you also very successfully painted how wide of a consensus the IHRA working definition has become. And while both of you were presenting, I saw a tweet that actually today it was announced that German companies, Volkswagen, Daimler, Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bahn have adopted the IHRA working definition, speaking about its practical applications and how it goes far beyond any academic debate. And Mike, to what you said, it was meant to be a practical tool and guideline. So with that, I would actually like to share a presentation with you. It will be easier for everyone to follow. Yeah, so I'd like to start actually with a few words of why are we having this conversation today, and why did we decide that drafting a set of recommendations for policymakers on NGO funding is relevant. I will not be saying anything new to any of you, but I would like to summarize that there has been a significant increase in anti-Semitic incidents over the years. You can see in front of you reports from ADL in the States, all the way to AJC, American Jewish Committee, or the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, all reporting an increased sense of insecurity, physical insecurity by Jews, both in the States and in Europe, both on social media, and needless to say, the shootings in synagogues that we have seen over the last few years have shaken both the Jewish community and the international community significantly. So there is a momentum and obviously a need to address the growing anti-Semitism in a more holistic manner. Not surprisingly, the NGOs reinforce these general trends. And we see that many of so-called human rights and humanitarian NGOs, non-governmental organizations, actually propagate anti-Semitic rhetoric and spread anti-Semitic tropes without any sanctions applied. Their staff and executives tolerate anti-Semitic language and do not sanction it, even when it's reported on it in the media. And almost all of them, definitely those involved in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is what we at NGO Monitor focus on, they dismiss any notion that they might be doing so. So even the mere discussion that there might be notions of anti-Semitism in some of their statements is dismissed per se. Now, these groups come in all sizes and shapes, and they range from smaller Palestinian NGOs and go all the way to big and extremely powerful and influential voices in the human rights and humanitarian community, such as the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. I'm sharing with you only a small selection of such examples that we have collected over the years. You see Oxfam Belgium and Oxfam UK. Here, a Palestinian organization, Badil, who in 2010 had this poster, this anti-Semitic poster, win its annual poster competition. A Palestinian Medical Relief Society sharing horrific images of corpse in striped uniforms. And if there is one common denominator across the board here, is actually the combination of what we know of classic anti-Semitism and its more contemporary manifestations that usually come in a form of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish state narratives. Now, each time that we would record and document any of these incidents, we would be met with words like it's an isolated case, isolated incident, but when laid out all together, they create a sort of an atmosphere. They create a much broader sense that that these groups operate in a hateful anti-Semitic environment, which is being tolerated. Now, as our distinguished speaker said, the IHRA working definition is the best existing practical definition that we have today. It has reached the broadest possible international consensus, has been adopted, as both Mike and Ellie mentioned, by parliaments, international bodies, institutions, companies, some organizations. But the challenge that we face right now, and this goes across the board, is how to transition from political support that the working definition obviously has gathered to practice, to its practical application. How do we contextualize the definition? How do we put it in practical use? Now, Mike mentioned many examples from student bodies, universities, many examples of law enforcement, police forces, and so on. And what we are presenting in our policy paper is a set of practical recommendations to do exactly that in the NGO funding context. We share in our policy papers 10 practical recommendations on how governments can use the IHRA working definition as a practical tool to ensure that, on one hand, they do not fund organizations who engage in anti-Semitism, on the other hand, can monitor and then sanction cases if such cases occur. We offer examples on existing best practices in the context of how governments engage and fund civil society organizations. And we offer a list of examples of NGO anti-Semitism in order to contextualize this and show the magnitude of the challenge. I will just very quickly walk you through the recommendations. You will see actually that they're quite straightforward and they would make sense to anyone. We suggest that and recommend that governments develop guidelines and best practices across all the
Olga, you're frozen.
Olga, you're frozen.
development and cooperation aid to NGOs. We recommend to incorporate or mention the IHRA working definition in calls for proposals and grant agreements between governments and NGOs. We suggest governments to introduce specific vetting mechanisms that rely on the use of IHRA working definition in choosing which NGOs to work with, and we suggest that they apply these vetting mechanisms on regular recurring basis. We propose to governments to run regular evaluations that are not based on self-reporting by NGOs. Rather, the government should develop their own in-house investigative capacities and procedures, including defining specific sanctions and remedies in those cases when it is proven that NGOs promoted anti-Semitism. We believe that there should be specific sanctions communicated clearly with grantees, such as cancellation of grants, clear rules to who is eligible, and as well as if an NGO promoted anti-Semitism and was sanctioned, when shall that NGO become eligible again to apply for governmental funding? On a more broader level, we suggest that parliaments themselves should engage on the subject. And we do acknowledge that NGO activities and NGO funding is sometimes a controversial issue. All the more reason for parliaments to engage with it. So parliamentary groups on anti-Semitism or friendship parliamentary groups between, say, Israel and any other country should discuss NGO funding and put it in the context of the IHRA working definition. IHRA working definition can also be mentioned in the budgets of states in all issues related to funding or other legislations. We advise the governments to engage with national IHRA delegations, the IHRA Permanent Office, as well as representatives of the local Jewish communities and other experts on anti-Semitism beyond the classical topics and issues, meaning on NGO funding as well. Exactly because it is often a controversial issue, it is all that more important that engage with experts who can offer that fine-tuned contextualization. We recommend governments to run regular training sessions on IHRA working definition and how to apply it on NGO funding to their staff and experts in relevant ministries, agencies, and diplomatic missions. And zooming even more out, and this is our last recommendation, our policy paper focuses on anti-Semitism and benchmarks it to IHRA, but we do recognize that similar standards and monitoring capacities and sanctions should be formalized for all forms of racism and discrimination, not only anti-Semitism. There is a lot of hate being spread, especially on social media, and NGOs sometimes play a very, very important role in disseminating these hateful messages. And we believe that by painting clear red lines, governments actually will be able to safeguard their allocation of public funds better. Some of the existing best practices that I would like to share with you. Mike mentioned the European Commission's Handbook that was released only a few weeks ago. We welcomed it as an extremely important policy set of policy recommendations, and we were extremely happy that it included a whole chapter on funding to civil society by governments, both as a way of promoting those NGOs who adopt and respect the IHRA working definition, as well as using the working definition as a sort of a controls mechanism. In 2017, Swiss government adopted a law, first of its type, that deals only with NGOs and basically says that Swiss funding will not go to NGOs who promote hate, anti-Semitism, and violence. Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2018 introduced very specific guidelines for funding of Palestinian NGOs that included specific language on anti-Semitism as well. This last year, French Prime Minister's office announced that it will be applying our working definition on NGO funding as well. Bundestag resolution in Germany from 2019. I don't need to mention all of them, but there is enough of policy precedent already in place that on NGO funding and IHRA working definition, that we believe that more governments should and take them into account and incorporate them in their standard procedures and of engagement with civil society. So with this, I would like to finish the very quick presentation of our policy paper that will be published on our website shortly after this official launch. And I would like to open the floor for questions.
Olga?
Yes.
First of all,
Gerald.
Thank you very much. That was very good presentation, very succinct presentation of what has been at least a year's worth of work, and was now launching sending it out for discussion with leading policymakers around the world. I want to just make a quick comment about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in the context. And that is, and I should have said this at the beginning, tomorrow marks the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's the day that the international community, it's not the day that Israel and the Jewish people celebrate, or mark, not celebrate, but mark and memorialize the Shoah. But it is important that in the United Nations and in the European Union, European Parliament, at least virtually, and in many other international settings, the Holocaust Remembrance Day is marked. There's obviously a very close, I say obviously, but sometimes it's missed, that close connection between memorializing and remembering the Shoah and also standing strong and countering contemporary examples of anti-Semitism. And that's really the foundation for all of this discussion. And I think that it ties a lot of the pieces together to keep that in mind. Olga, do you want to go ahead and start? I see one set of questions. Maybe I'll start with that, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
There are a number of questions that talk about the Israel examples. And again, as Michael Whine said, these are examples that are presented. They're non-binding, and yet those have withdrawn the greatest amount of hostility and criticism. And so there are a number of people that ask in different forms. First of all, is it possible for NGOs to be critical of Israeli domestic foreign policy without being anti-Semitic? I think the answer to the question is obvious, but the way that's posed is very important, because that's very often the claims that are made. And another question that asks specifically about the statement by J Street and the New Israel Fund and other organizations that oppose the adoption and the enforcement of the working definition and claim that stifles free speech. And I think those are important elements in this that are going to also be used by the NGOs, and they already are being used to make the claim that they shouldn't be subject to any form of regulation or checks and balances or even criticism, and certainly not something that deals with the anti-Semitic elements as Olga presented. So I'd be interested, I think it's important, all three of our speakers might want to comment on that. I'll leave the floor open and ask you to respond. Ellie, your mic is first.
Yeah, of course, people, NGOs, governments can criticize actions by the State of Israel. That's not the issue. I think what many of these are trying to do is hold Israel to a different level, to make Israel the Jew amongst nations. They don't recognize the State of Israel, or they want to undermine the status of Israel as a state. Look, I'm bitterly critical of the Israeli government, despite the fact that my family is in Israel. I'm bitterly critical. Well, that's not the point.
We're all bitterly critical.
Well, it's not the point as far as I'm concerned in doing this work. When we met in Vienna at the home of the EUMC director, having gathered in all these academic dissertations on anti-Semitism, we had no thought about the academic world. We were focused on the question, what do European police forces and human rights commissions need in order to monitor anti-Semitism, given its mutating nature? That the anti-Semitism of the 1980s and 90s is not the anti-Semitism of the 1930s and 1940s. It's changed. We have to recognize that, and we have to take that into account, and we have to educate police forces. We have to educate judges, prosecutors to that. So when we had that discussion, we weren't talking about academics. It's true, we in the thing, we talked about a holistic approach, because you can't deal with it piecemeal. And that's the strategy that the European Commission has taken. I said I would come back to the European Declaration. The European Council is the body of European foreign ministers or prime ministers, or not heads of state, but political leads. That is the highest level within the European Union. And they are saying to all the member states, if you want to combat anti-Semitism, it's got to be in a holistic manner. You can't just teach cops. because when they bring a case to court, the prosecutors won't deal with it and the judges won't understand what you're dealing with. So in that sense, across criminal justice agencies, it's got to be holistic. And then there's no point in doing it if you haven't taught children about anti-Semitism and where it leads, i.e. 1939 to 45. So educationists have to be involved, and that is very much part of both the European Commission's work and UNESCO and the OSCE and the World Jewish Congress. It's all focused on educating people from a young age all the way up to tertiary education. So you can't leave out everything. It's got to be a holistic manner. But that's not to say you can't be critical of the state of Israel. Of course you can. And the working definition very specifically says that. And that's why I get so annoyed when they say, well, you're stopping free speech about Israel. You're stopping criticism of Israel. We're doing no such thing.
Gerald, I'm also happy to jump in on this question.
Please.
I think it just, it harks back to what I was saying earlier in my remarks, which is that in today's society, in certain circles, it's not polite to kind of references Jews as the Jews control the world, or the Jews control the media, the Jews control the economy, and so on. And so the acceptable form of Jew hatred becomes the hatred of the Jewish state of Israel. And so, to my mind, these notions that the IHRA working definition somehow silences speech on criticism of Israel, it's really just become a false flag. It's become an excuse for people who really want to express their anti-Semitism, and they believe that they have cover to do that under by supposedly criticizing the Jewish state of Israel, and so it's the definition clearly states that criticizing Israeli policy, like any other government's policy, is open, it's normal, it's acceptable. And I think that anyone who has had any exposure to Israelis themselves knows that probably the biggest critics of the government of Israel are Israelis. So, Israel is a healthy and thriving democracy, and certainly there is tremendous free speech in that country, and there's tremendous free speech about Israel around the world. So, I do believe that the reason why we are seeing this so-called controversy and pushback against the adoption of the IHRA working definition is the very fact that it is successful. The effort has been successful because we're seeing more and more countries and entities adopting the definition. And also it's successful because the definition in itself is a success, again, because it addresses all forms of anti-Semitism. So the pushback that I think we're experiencing right now is a sign of the success of the effort. I also want to share, since we're sharing news of the day, that, and I was so pleased to hear what Olga was sharing earlier about German corporations. I just saw a tweet earlier today that the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the major umbrella organization of Jewish organizations in the United States, 51 of the organizations on the eve of Holocaust Remembrance Day have formally adopted the IHRA definition. So that's also today's good news, and I'm happy to share that with the audience.
Good. Ellie, can I go with another question that's come up in this context? You were, until very recently, part of the State Department's team, now at the ambassadorial level of dealing with anti-Semitism, and very active with working with Elon Carr, and tremendous amount of work that was done. Do you have a sense of how much this is going to be continued? The issue of bipartisanship. These are issues that should not be ideological left or right. They should be ones that are, and at least in terms of the language that we hear, they are endorsed by many Democrats, maybe some on the fringes, not so much, but the Democrats, the Republicans on these issues, it should be bipartisan. Do you have a sense of how much of the work that you did specifically in terms of the applying the working definition in the realm of human rights, perhaps also in when the US rejoins, as we expect is going to happen? I think they've already announced they plan to do it, the UN Human Rights Council. where you have so many expressions of anti-Semitism from delegates, and I've heard it from Iranian diplomats and Syrian diplomats. Occasionally, the Americans usually will stand up and protest. Occasionally, a European, not enough, will criticize strongly the kind of language that's used. And of course, we often hear it from the NGO presentations when they take the stand, whether it's Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or many of the others. So do you think there's a chance that this emphasis will be adopted?
I'll tell you something. Yeah, Gerald. So in terms of anti-Semitism policy, our administration broke ground by creating the policy that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And so that was a guiding principle in all the work that we did in the Office of the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism. It was a guiding principle that you saw throughout the administration. And so I certainly hope that the next administration will stay consistent to that policy. Again, it's the recognition that singling out Israel is anti-Semitism, and holding Israel to a standard that no other country is held to, that's anti-Semitism, or denying the Jewish people the very right to sovereignty, that's anti-Semitism. So it is my great hope that the next administration will maintain that policy. And then to your question about the United Nations, look, I think any observer of the UN has seen that they have had this almost obsessive relationship with Israel. There is just this unbelievable amount of attention paid to the small state, and especially at the UNHCR, like you referenced earlier. And at the same time, we see countries that are committing atrocities against its own people, like Syria gassing her own citizens, like Iran's human rights record, where just yesterday another world-renowned athlete was executed by the Iranian regime yesterday, and that's something that I've spoken on, and so on and so forth. So you've got the most horrible countries with the most horrific human rights records really not receiving any attention at the UN. And then you've got Israel, which is a thriving, flourishing democracy with a very solid human rights record, being the consistent target of UN. So, again, as you said, the Biden administration has announced that they are going to rejoin UNHCR. They've said that they're going to refund UNRWA, and to speak on UNRWA for a minute and anti-Semitism and the IHRA definition, in UNRWA textbooks, we have seen over and again incitement to hatred against Jews. I don't understand how any honest person who would like to see peace in the Middle East can think for a second that they should be funding textbooks which teach innocent children to hate, right? We're never going to break the so-called cycle of violence and reach a state of peace in the Middle East if children are indoctrinated to hate. So these are all policies that I really very much hope that the Biden administration will think very carefully before they take these next steps. And in terms of bipartisan support for these issues, I would tell you that there are many voices that have asked for the United States Congress itself to adopt the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And I think that would be a huge step forward for the United States, because we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, too many members of the US Congress truly cross the line into anti-Semitic speech. And this is something that does not reflect the values of the United States. And there's really no better move that the Congress can take to truly show bipartisan support for the Jewish people than to adopt the IHRA working definition. And it's something that I very much hope our leadership will consider doing.
Thanks, Ellie. Olga, do you add anything, or are there more questions that we have time for? I'm kind of losing track of the time here, but hopefully you're still monitoring.
I think we have a few more minutes.
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
The position of US envoy is mandated by US law. It's not for me to criticize America, but I think it was a weakness in having that appointment be a partisan appointment. I've traveled pretty much the world with all 4 of the US envoys, 2 Democrat and 2 Republican. And I think it weakens their position by being essentially a presidential appointment. I think it will be sufficient to have them responsible to US Department of State, although as a Brit, I've got no say in this, nor do I want to have. The other weakness, I think, was that the US envoy was not at the same level as the others. All European states are appointing envoys at ministerial or post-ministerial or ambassadorial level. It was important in terms of the perception of the USA that they appoint someone at a similar level. And I'm glad to see that the US recently passed that legislation to make sure that, that your envoy is at that level. Can I just say one other thing, because we've had a couple of references to the UN. I was at a meeting just a couple of weeks ago with the newly appointed United Nations High Representative on the Alliance of Civilizations, the former Spanish Foreign Minister, Miguel Moratinos, who plans wonderful things to do with anti-Semitism. Whether he will be able to do so remains to be seen, but he's certainly very ambitious, and he has shown his bona fides in the years gone by, particularly when he hosted the OSCE conference on anti-Semitism in Cordoba, which was a fantastic event. And also, of course, Shahid, his report, but he's a special representative. And although it was presented and accepted by the General Secretary, it doesn't, and it's a very important and terrific document. Nevertheless, having a high representative in UN terms gives it so much more power. So I really look forward to seeing what Miguel Moratinos is going to pull out of the hat in the next couple of months.
Mike, the issue of NGO statements, activities that cross the line into anti-Semitism, and the role of the United Nations in amplifying that, they're very closely tied together. So although our report is aimed primarily at the NGOs and their funders, it does have spillover with. I'm hoping that you're right about Miguel Moratinos. His position is very weakly defined. It's not clear. We have been in touch with his office, and I've actually been at meetings when he was the position he held, I think, in the European Union or Spanish.
He's the foreign minister.
I don't remember anymore. It was 20, 30 years ago.
He was the foreign minister that got all this started.
Then he had also a role in the EU, I believe.
Yeah.
He's
the MP for Cordoba, the town of Jews and Muslims.
Right.
And he
uses that.
Takes that responsibility very, very seriously.
The last 6 or 8 months on this. Okay, that's an important element.
Yeah. In terms of NGOs, you've got to develop the capacity to read Arabic, because a lot of their stuff, particularly the educational material, is published in Arabic.
We have a full-time Arabic researcher.
That's so important.
Our findings have been based on that. One of the interesting things is you look at some of the NGOs, the more accepted and respected NGOs that are Palestinian, and then you see that in their Arabic websites, as distinct from their English, they're very different. And the Arabic ones,
they're not stupid. They're not stupid. Of course, they'll say different things in different languages.
Well, but not expecting to be found out.
They don't expect to be found out because we have not developed sufficient capacity to look at their stuff in Arabic or Iranian.
Yep, I agree. And we at NGO Monitor,
one other point, I mean, my focus is on governments and their law enforcement agencies. It has been for the last 25 years.
Almost every government official we've spoken to among the funders will tell us that they don't have the capacity, and they rely on the self-reporting of the NGOs. Oh, we're not anti-Semitic. That's basically where it ends. So
no, they're just ignorant and they don't care.
And that's one of the main driving forces behind this policy paper. Olga,
if I may, I'm not even sure that you said, they're not stupid, they don't want to be caught. I think oftentimes there is an actual lack of education, right? I mean, many of them do not know, or they don't realize that what they're saying is anti-Semitic. So the education needs to go in all different ways. And this obviously is particularly the case with all the, Israel-related expressions of anti-Semitism, where they see, many of them see it as a legitimate criticism of Israeli policies. And they make a very strong distinction between Jews, and they're not anti-Semitic, but yet they only criticize the Jews living in Israel. I think that, and this is what our many elected officials, when we meet with them and we show them the examples of NGO anti-Semitism, then they say to us, okay, we understand what the problem is. So tell us who to work with. Tell us which NGOs should we work with. And it's a dangerous path, making a white list or something like that. And I think it goes to what you said, Mike, that we cannot educate the entire world, right? Everyone is free to.
Why not?
Because everyone can create an organization. And if I can, tomorrow raise enough funds and create my own organization, as long as I'm not breaching a law, I'm free to say just about anything I want. At the same time, if governments are allocating public funds, then the governments need to draw the line of what is acceptable when public funds are being used. And I think by doing that, the governments actually dissolve from this responsibility. The responsibility is then with the NGOs.
That's why it's so heartening to see those Arab states that have signed the Abraham Accords agreeing to teach Jewish history and the Holocaust. Tunisia has done so for many years. They only stopped doing it because of the revolution, the Arab Spring, but they've gone back to doing it. Bahrain, UAE, Morocco. I mean, I was in Morocco a couple of times recently, and people coming up to me, or my wife rather, and saying, "Are you Israeli? Welcome. Can we help you?" I mean, the fact is that there is some thirst in some Muslim countries to learn about the Jews. And that is something that you and other NGOs in this arena should be attending to. Because I don't deal with NGOs, I only deal with governments and their law enforcement agencies. So, I'm a little bit removed from this area, but I see the need.
Mike, I'm so thrilled that you just brought this subject up because the Abraham Accord, I believe, has been a true game changer in the region. And one of our proudest achievements in our Office of the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism was two groundbreaking MOUs that we signed, one with Bahrain's King Hamad Center for Peaceful Coexistence and the other with Morocco's association Mimouna. And we partnered with these bodies to together, and going forward, the State Department will be in partnership with these organizations to combat anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and Islamophobia. And I would tell you that I was in the Emirates recently myself, and I believe that a Jew today walking in the streets of Dubai, a visible Jew with a kippah or a Magen David, is safer than, unfortunately, in many capitals in Europe. And so I do believe that it is going to be very important for all of us to spread the good word about the changes in the Muslim world, and soon the role modeling that they're going to be doing for all of us.
And on that positive note, despite the fact that the topic of the webinar of this launch is not so wasn't so festive, but on this positive note, I think we will have to wrap it up and finish our presentation tonight. Thank you so much, Ellie and Mike, for taking the time and for sharing your expertise and experience, and for shedding more light on the importance of the IHRA working definition and how the different ways in which it can be applicable, and obviously for supporting our modest recommendations to donor governments and when they engage with NGOs and when they choose to allocate public funds to NGOs. The civil society in general is a crucial part of any democracy, and a vibrant civil society is pivotal. We support civil society and NGOs in their activities, but in the same breath, we call for integrity and for the same basically vetting procedures that any other organization out there, government, businesses, and so on, have to apply. The civil society should do the same. I would like to also apologize to everyone in the audience whose questions were not brought up. There were so many, but time is limited, especially when speakers are so eloquent and interesting. We will be sharing with all of you in the next hour the actual policy paper per email, so stay tuned. Gerald, thank you for your vision and leadership as always. And I wish everyone a good night and stay tuned for our next event.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.